Well, hello everyone. My name is Kathleen Olive, and I'm here today to talk to you about the art and history of the Japanese garden. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take a walk through Japanese history and the way in which certain stages of Japanese history have informed upon the development of Japanese gardens as a tradition and also as a very beautiful art form. Something that I think it's important to start with is a fact of Japanese history that perhaps we're less familiar with, because I think in general we're a little less familiar with Japanese history. And that is the fact that in the 17th century, in fact, from 1636, the military leader or shogun of Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu, made the decision to close the country's borders quite physically. So he limited trade to the southwest of the islands. You can see the arrow of my cursor down here circling in the area of Nagasaki, for example, which was one of the ports where some limited foreign trade was permitted, for example, with Dutch merchants and sailors, and also some limited trade was permitted with China as well. But for the most part, the entire country was closed off, it's called. We call this period Sakoku, or closed country politics. And the idea was that Japan would become an autarky. It would become self-sufficient. It could provide all of its own needs within the country's own borders. But of course, there was also political and cultural policies at work here as well. Politically, the newly established Tokugawa shogunate, which had managed to wrest power across Japanese territory from two other rival shoguns and their dynasties. At this stage, and we'll come to this later, but at this stage, the Emperor of Japan has very limited influence, and the shogun is the real ruler of the country. So politically, Sakoku allowed the Tokugawa shogunate to reinforce its own position without the fear of external political influence. And it was also a cultural policy. One of the things the shogunate was looking to limit was the influence of Christianity through the presence of Christian missionaries, for example. So from 1636 until midway through the 19th century, Japan's borders are essentially closed to the outside world. It has only very limited cultural and mercantile interaction with other countries, particularly, as I said, with Europe through the Netherlands, and some limited engagement continues, for example, with China. This means that when we come to talk about Japanese history, and particularly about the art forms that have developed within Japan, and I'm including the garden as one of these art forms, we're talking about a tradition that for hundreds of years developed in almost entire isolation from the rest of the world. And if you think about it, that means that a number of Japanese art forms that we particularly privilege, from woodblock prints to textile design, for example, kimono art, calligraphic art, this beautiful fan at lower left, for example, and at the moment we're particularly interested again in Japanese ceramic traditions. These art forms that we really value and privilege now are relatively new to those of us in the West. So we only came to know about them after about 1850, when Commodore Matthew Perry steams into Tokyo Harbour at the head of a fleet of American steamships, and he in fact forces Japan to open up and begin trading with the West. And this is when those highly developed decorative Japanese art forms start to enter the Western market in quantities that they simply haven't before. So on the one hand, we have Westerners from the middle of the 19th century starting to become fascinated by these new to our eyes Japanese art forms. But on the other hand, for hundreds of years, you've had Japanese art forms, particularly decorative arts, which in the Western tradition are often spoken of as the so-called minor art forms. You've actually had those art forms developing purely really for an educated local audience. They haven't been drawing strong influence, some influence, but not strong influence from international trends in arts and aesthetics. And because they've been developed predominantly for a local market, they don't have to worry about explaining themselves to an uneducated viewer. So they are able to develop, in a sense, within a bell jar. They've developed a visual language that can be understood from the whole extent of the tradition from which it emerges by a local audience, but which for a foreign audience starts to require some unpacking, is fascinating, but requires some unpacking. So what I want to do today is unpack the garden tradition within that history and explain to you how it's emerged out of the various periods of Japanese history. And to do that, we really need to start with some very practical considerations. For one thing, we know that in any country, any nation's garden history, we know that obviously the local climate, the local topography, the sheer chemistry of the local soil, those things will have a really strong impact on how a garden tradition develops. So the thing to keep in mind in Japan is, well, for one thing, they have a much greater source of water than we do, for example. So they are able to develop gardens that require a lot more moisture. Think of the cultivation of moss as an art form in the Japanese garden. Very hard for us to achieve here in Australia, for example. But think too about the geography of Japan. So 75% of the landmass of the Japanese archipelago is mountainous, and that's quite extraordinary. It means, for one thing, that there's very little flat arable land with respect to how much of the landmass is mountainous. And that means that, in fact, carving a garden space out, a space purely for aesthetic enjoyment and relaxation, will always be something that comes into tension with the notion of agriculture, dedicating enough space to agricultural needs. But it also means, quite simply, that rocks are prized. It's a very rocky, mountainous landscape, and there's a great connoisseurship of rocks and boulders in Japan. We know that historically Japanese emperors would go personally to select the rocks that were going to be used in their garden, and that sometimes the rocks, the boulders that were imported from all over Japan and even from China were the most expensive component of a Japanese garden. So for one thing, we've got this appreciation for rocks. For another, we've got this abundance of water, but we've also got a very constricted viewpoint. So whereas in Australia, we're quite used to, across a lot of our country, being able to see off into the far distance, the horizon, without interfering masses and volumes in front of our eyes. In Japan, the viewpoint is often very constricted. So you've got mountains in the way, you've got hills in front of mountains, you've got rocky precipices and cliffs, you've got water being constricted through narrow waterways and then leaping off hundreds of metres of cliff in a beautiful, spectacular waterfall. So just keep in mind that on the one hand, the Japanese garden emerges out of a very different geography to our own, and naturally that has an impact on its development. But also in terms of the conceptualization of the garden in Japanese history. The Japanese language has allowed for various types of descriptions of what a garden means. So the very etymology of the various words for garden in Japanese gives us a window onto how the garden is conceived of as a space. So one word, for example, for garden would be niwa, which refers to an expanse of territory. So something quite big, quite open, nature being nature, really. So a great expanse of nature just doing its own thing. Whereas on the other hand, we have quite a different word for garden, a word that encompasses a sense of fields with an enclosure around them. So not nature being nature, nature that in fact we have put a border around so that we can use it for various things, whether to till those fields or whether to enjoy them in an aesthetic sense. So these are two differing concepts of what a garden really is. On the one hand, you've got an appreciation that in a garden, nature just does its own thing. And on the other hand, you've got this appreciation for the way in which nature can be controlled in order to bring us more benefit, more enjoyment. And so often in Japanese gardens, we actually see this tension between differing ideas of what a garden is, a tension between nature being allowed to go wild or go seemingly wild. Obviously, there's a lot of intervention that's required sometimes to have nature look apparently wild. But then on the other hand, we've got this sense of nature being subdued. So think, for example, about the contrast between a burst of cherry blossom, nature just apparently doing its own thing, and on the other hand, the control that's required in something like bonsai. So very, very careful clipping and pruning. And I'm showing you an example of that here. We'll come back to this garden, but this is the stroll garden, and later we'll talk about what a stroll garden is. But this is the stroll garden at a temple in Kyoto called Ryoanji, very famous temple that we'll also return to. And you can see here there's quite a tension between that wild profusion of cherries in blossom along the surface of the lake, the way they kind of billow on the edge of this pond here. But then you've also got the sense of control with the flat surface of that lake and the way in which it's completely unruffled, completely under control. So a tension between wildness on the one hand and careful control on the other. And that's something we'll come back to again and again as we look at these gardens. Another fundamental kind of foundational concept that I would want you to keep in mind when admiring a Japanese garden is the way in which Japanese gardens can be made up of objects that are apparently very, very fragile, quite ephemeral, organic, vulnerable, impermanent. One thing to keep in mind is that nature in Japan can be quite changing. So remember that the archipelago is in a very seismic zone. We know there are earthquakes. We know there are volcanoes like Mount Fuji. We've seen in our own lifetime tsunamis and their devastating effects in Japan. So there's no point really building what we might think of as an iconic European garden with stone urns and lovely stone fences when tomorrow there may well be a tremor and the whole thing will come crashing down. Instead, what we see in the Japanese garden is a real privileging of materials that are apparently quite fragile. So what you're seeing here is a very famous bamboo grove, again, outside Kyoto, a suburb of Kyoto called Arashiyama, very famous, used, I think, by Qantas as a promotional image. And in this bamboo forest, and this is not a bamboo forest for its own sake, it is actually a forest of bamboo that will be harvested and used as a raw material. Bamboo is used all over Asia, for example, as a highly tensile building construction material, particularly in scaffolding, for example. And you can see that in order to enclose the bamboo grove, to make clear what is bamboo grove and what is path, they've actually used more bamboo as a fence. So the struts of that fence are dried bamboo, and then the fence itself is made up of like a rice straw. So those are materials that will degrade over time because they are organic, they're natural, they're naturally fragile. They'll constantly need to be renewed. And we'll talk about that concept more as well. But you can see it's that organic nature, that apparent fragility that's actually being celebrated here. And you also end up with beautiful contrasts. So the live bamboo, for example, and the dried bamboo that separates the spaces. So very, very careful use of organic materials that highlight a sense of kind of natural impermanence in the landscape, in the climate around you. And this is tied, I think, to one of the fundamental things that underpins Japanese garden history, and that is the Japanese understanding of and connection to nature. And if we want to look for the origins of this kind of a concept, the extraordinary privileging that the Japanese have of nature and the natural world around us, we might want to look at Japan's religious history. So in Japan, the local or indigenous religious tradition is Shinto, which means the way of the gods. And Shinto holds that natural objects around us, rocks, waterfalls, trees, people, animals, we can all be godlike. We can all have some form of strong positive energy that sets us apart as divine. And that can be in animate objects such as people, but it can just as well be in inanimate objects. So it's an animistic belief that sees this kind of strong divine energy in objects, in the natural objects in the world around us. And the earliest gardens, we think, in the Japanese tradition were no more than enclosures that set space aside. So perhaps there were rocks such as these ones that you see in the water at Mie, for example, which were seen to represent, in this case, the two creation gods of the Shinto tradition. And so those rocks, therefore, were divine. They needed to be set apart from the everyday hustle and bustle of life. And so you can see they've been roped off here with a rice straw. Again, remember, an organic material, something that will require renewal, that is apparently fragile but is actually very strong. And that rope simply denotes that this is a pure divine place that should not be defiled by our everyday feet. And if you've visited a Shinto shrine in Japan, you will have seen great big trees, for example, that have ropes like this around them to denote that they're special. So it's a very, very simple way of enclosing some area in nature in order to designate its status as something quite special. And also, and this is important, something that is a pure place, something that shouldn't be defiled. And we'll see how important the notion of cleanliness is to the Japanese garden. Here, for example, at one of Japan's most extraordinary gardens, which I'll return to, Kenrokuen in Kanazawa. And here you see a team of volunteers that heads out every day. They pick up every leaf that has fallen overnight on the garden, on the path. They sweep. Here they're pruning moss in the foreground. This person is actually pruning the moss, for example, clipping it very carefully. You can see all of the people lined up in the background. This is a very popular garden. But this idea of cleanliness is not something that Japanese gardeners shy away from. Lots of maintenance, lots of small judicious pruning decisions, for example. Again, think about bonsai. But you might want to see a connection here with this important religious tradition, which is Shinto. But Shinto is not the only strong religious tradition in Japan. Equally important, particularly from the 6th century, is Buddhism. And after Buddhism is introduced to Japan from China through Korea, many things change. So Japan becomes a literate culture. It's obviously had its own language, but it now has a way to write its language down and record it. And it also imports, along with Buddhist religious ideas, it also imports a number of artistic and aesthetic traditions as well. So this is a very important moment in Japanese history. And one of the things that happens in Japanese gardens after Buddhism becomes such an important religion and religious cultural tradition within the archipelago of Japan, something else that becomes important is how a garden can function as a space in Buddhist belief. And that is that it can be an earthly representation of paradise. It can reflect for us the world that we are striving to achieve, the kind of paradise that we're striving to reach. So here you see, for example, in the bottom right-hand image, you're seeing an image of, in fact, the oldest garden that we still know of in Japan's history, again, just outside Kyoto. It comes from the Heian period, which we'll return to talking about shortly. And this is known as the Phoenix Hall. It's known for that by that name for a particular reason. So in the upper right-hand corner, you're seeing a recreation of this Phoenix Hall, in fact, in Hawaii, in this case. Down the bottom, you're seeing the heavily restored, we would even really want to say rebuilt Phoenix Hall, now outside Kyoto in Japan. And you can see, again, I beg your pardon, you can see again an extraordinary number of visitors at this site. And the Phoenix Hall is called by that name because when you look at that aerial shot at upper left, you can see, in fact, it's like a phoenix coming down to land on that pond. It has its wings outstretched here on the sides, and what's harder to see, but you can see it down here at bottom right, is it has a wing coming out of the building that functions like the phoenix's tail. So the phoenix is a symbol for many religions, but also in the Buddhist tradition of a rebirth and a renewal. And so you have the phoenix coming into land on the surface of the water. You have a representation of a particular type of paradise that a Buddhist sect called Amida Buddhism really strives to reach. And so the garden can sometimes have these religious meanings as well. Again, an imported belief system that comes into Japan quite early on, around about the same time as Buddhism arrives, is Chinese understandings of how the space around us can be understood and subtly controlled thanks to what we might call astrological systems, or perhaps we would call this geomancy. Some people say geomancy. And what the assumptions are here, the assumptions are that we can affect some kind of control on the space around us, that good or auspicious energies will come from certain directions or cardinal points on the compass, and that inauspicious or unfortunate, unlucky forces will come from other points on the compass around us, and that by carefully playing with the spaces in which we live and move, we can manipulate those directions so that the good forces arrive to us and we protect ourselves from the less auspicious forces. And you might be more familiar with this concept under the term feng shui. So that's the principle of feng shui, which was quite interesting to the West in, say, the 80s and 90s in particular. So just to give you an example of how this has affected Japanese history, well, the entire city of present-day Kyoto was originally planned under these principles of Chinese geomancy, or what we would call feng shui, with a very wide central avenue designed essentially as a fire break, not that it really fulfilled that job. All of the architecture being built out of wooden paper, you can understand what the risk of fire is to Japan. With an imperial enclosure at the top, surrounded by a river on either side, very, very big, strong mountain in the northeast, which is the direction from which a threat is expected to come under this Chinese principles of astrology. So protected from the threat to the northeast by a big mountain, for example, a mountain covered in Buddhist monasteries that were also going to somehow affect a kind of mantle of sacred protection. But the entire city, it wasn't built haphazard. It was built to be protected according to this system of how we understand space around us and maximize its positive influence on us. And this is really significant in the Japanese garden. And it often has a working out in the garden in a way that's quite difficult for us to see unless we know to look for it. So this is a very small courtyard garden in a jewelry shop in Kanazawa. Kanazawa is famous for gold leaf. And so this is a gold jewelry shop in Kanazawa's Higashichaya or tea district. You can see it's not very big. You can tell that from the size of the paving stones in the background there. But in fact, this tiny little space, which practically brings air into the building, practically brings light into the building too. The other thing that it does is that it balances the positive forces around us, what we might call yin, with the negative or less auspicious forces around us, what we would call yang. And those can be balanced by a careful control of the 5 natural elements in this tradition. So not 4, but 5. And they are wood, which here is represented by the bamboo, the spigot, fire. Believe me, there is a stone lantern here. If you've ever visited a Japanese garden, you'll know that there has to be a stone lantern somewhere. So the fire represented by the lantern, earth, which is here seen in the moss, for example, metal, that's the gilded rock that we have here, and water, which of course is going to drip out of that spigot into that beautiful basin below. So for us, very soothing in terms of sound, in terms of its effect on the atmosphere, a cooling effect in summer, for example, and beautiful light and circulation of air through the space. But the Japanese garden designer would say that the other reason you feel at ease in a space like this is because those negative and positive or active and passive forces have been carefully balanced through the design of the garden. That can be really difficult to see, as I've said, but you should know that impact is there. So now I'd like to move through a historical survey of the Japanese garden tradition and match for you some of the developments in gardens themselves against the historical developments or cultural developments of that period. And where I'd like to start is the Heian period. Now, the Heian period, we're talking about the 11th through to about the 13th centuries AD. For us, we would call that either the Dark Ages or the beginning of the Middle Ages. But to give you a kind of sense of what was happening in Japan at that period, it was a moment of extraordinary cultural flowering, the kind of moment that in the West we would call a Renaissance. So a very strong cultural movement that privileged literature, art, music, garden design. Now, we often talk about the Heian period with respect to literature, for example. This is a period in which that introduction of a Chinese way of writing down the Japanese language means that we get poetry, some of the earliest collections of haiku, for example. We have women being very important as literary forces. The Pillow Book, which you may have heard of, and The Tale of Genji, which I'm sure you will have heard of, were both written by women in the Heian period. And this is also a historical moment in which the emperor has extraordinary wealth, extraordinary power, and a very strong cultural presence. And he's ruling from a court in Kyoto where he is supported by a very strong community of aristocrats who have their own supporters and retainers. So for those people, the ruling elite, life is a series of appreciation of art, of music, of all of these cultural developments. And I've given you here on the screen just some of the more famous developments that arise from that period, from literature, as I've said at the upper left, to calligraphy and calligraphic arts. It's a very famous almost caricature of a scroll there in the middle, quite a biting social satire in this carnival of animals, and also painting. So that's a very beautiful painted set of silk screens at the bottom left. In terms of the garden in this period, the Heian period, we see a very particular type of garden being developed, what's called a pond touring or shinden garden. And the idea that's at work here is that all of these nobles, these aristocrats who support the emperor, they live in very large enclosed estates. You can see in this diagram that the estate is very carefully fenced off from the rest of the world. And everything that they need, they can access within this state, including pleasure grounds. But as you notice, the pleasure grounds here, rather than being an earth garden, they're actually a water garden. So the whole residence is oriented towards the garden, which is out on the water, going across a series of ponds. Notice that in the main residence, you have the patriarch and his family, and then in those side wings, you have other family groups. So we have a number of families living together on these extended estates. And so when they want to take their leisure, rather than stroll through a garden, they're more likely to get out into boats and be rowed across the garden. In other words, see the garden from water level. And the garden is what is located on the islands and as the water in the islands have been planned together. So we see the development of extensive networks of man-made ponds, for example. Now, sometimes what's being appreciated from that water level, remember people are admiring these gardens from the water level in a boat that they're being rowed out in. What they will appreciate will seem to arise up and out of the planar surface of the water that they're being rowed across. And so mass is what is particularly important. Shapes rising out of the ponds, the islands, for example, the pruned trees on those islands, the boulders on those islands, that's where the eye will go. And we could see something quite symbolic here. We could see a representation of a Buddhist idea about our consciousness. And at the center of our consciousness is the Buddhist mountain of Meru, for example. So our consciousness in this case might be the pond, and the island might represent Mount Meru. Or sometimes the islands might represent other symbolic things. So for example, two very auspicious animals, the crane and the turtle, one of which represents an extraordinary dynamic energy, and the other which represents a kind of a slow and steady stability. So both things that we need in our lives, but which we have to hold in a very careful balance. So these may look like rocks to you, but they are also understood to be a crane and a turtle. So they are, for the people viewing these very simple pond gardens, in fact, simple objects like boulders come to have a very strong symbolic meaning. So a rock in a Japanese garden is never just a rock. And so I want to show you another example of this, even though it's from a later period. So this is a very well-known garden in the same place where the bamboo grove that people may know is, Arashiyama. And at this garden at the Tenryuji temple, you can see again that it is a similar kind of garden. You've got the pond and you've got the mass of the islands and what's on the islands arising up out of that formlessness of the water. And that will obviously have much more of an effect if you see it from boat level. And one of the things that's happening here is a contrast between mass or volume and plane or line. So the line here would be the surface of the pond, and the mass, of course, is the shapes, the volume of the islands, and of course of that mass of trees in the distance as well. And so your eye roams between those two contrasting things to look at: a line, a straight line, and a sense of mass or volume. It's not all one thing. It's very clear that there are different types of structural components to look at. So just to take you back, we've already seen that quite early on. For example, I showed you this image of the cherry trees in bloom on the pond at Ryoanji, and you can see how that fluffy mass of the cherry blossom forms a strong contrast with the straight line of the pond. So there's a lot of interest here for the eye in terms of where it looks and what it's looking at. Now, after the Heian period, the emperor's power starts to become quite limited, mostly due to factional infighting within the imperial court. So precisely amongst those aristocratic families who are building these beautiful pond-touring gardens. And the emperor increasingly is reliant on military support. And the military support, in fact, by the 15th century, starts to become a direct threat to his rule. And increasingly, the emperor has no real power. He's living in a gilded cage in Kyoto, legitimating, conferring power upon various military leaders and their retainers beneath them. So this is the samurai system with which you may be familiar. And there's in fact a garden type that really appeals to that samurai class. And this is a garden that we call Karisan Swai. It literally means withered mountains rock. And we sometimes call these Zen gardens or dry gardens. And from that name Zen garden, you can hear that this too is a garden that is tied to a particular religious tradition, to the Zen Buddhist sect within Buddhism, which was a form of beliefs that really appealed to the samurai class. It says that life is hard, it's difficult. What life presents to our eyes is a distraction, sometimes an active deception, and that in order to appreciate the true meaning of life, it's the true meaning of the objects we see around us, it's necessary to meditate upon them at length. And also Zen Buddhism was a sect of Buddhism that also really privileged certain art forms, calligraphy, for example, garden design particularly, but also the tea ceremony, if you know anything about Japanese history. So they're not just, the samurai are not just men who are involved in fighting for control for their lords of the Japanese territory. They are also, when they are Zen Buddhists, people who are particularly interested in aesthetic developments of their own day. And so they particularly sponsor the rise of these Zen gardens, as we often call them. This is one of the most famous of them. It's called Ryoanji in Kyoto. So the same place where we saw those billowing cherry blossoms on the surface of the pond there. And while Zen acknowledges that life is hard and difficult and that its true nature is often concealed from us, Zen also recognizes that part of the beauty of life lies in the fact that its pleasures can be fleeting. So this is something for which the Japanese have a very lovely and untranslatable term, and that is mono no aware. And it literally means the pathos or melancholy of impermanent and beautiful things. So something is made more beautiful by the fact that it won't be with you forever. And all you have to do is think about the extraordinary celebrations that happen in Japan around cherry blossom time, for example, This was also a period in which people would have moon viewing parties to appreciate the full moon for the nights that it was with them, and then mourn its passing. And if you have a familiarity with Japanese haiku, you'll know that the seasons are often celebrated in this way in Japanese culture, that part of their beauty is the fact that they are going to pass away inevitably. The wind, the rain, a storm, they will carry cherry blossom away in a matter of hours. And that is actually what makes cherry blossom so valuable, the fact that it isn't with you for very long at all. And this was something that these hardened samurai must have appreciated, that life is short and difficult, and that part of its beauty is, in fact, in how temporary its pleasures are. So this was something that they meditated on, and they brought it into the art forms that they valued. The tea ceremony, for example. So this is an image of a tea room that's being refined at exactly the same time as these Zen rock gardens in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. And in this room, samurai were all equal. There was no one with a greater status than anyone else. Everyone was supposed to remove their weapons before they came in. Everyone had to climb in through a low door so that they all bowed to one another quite automatically as they entered. And they would not talk about the everyday matters of life while they were in this space. While the tea was being prepared for them, they would talk about art, music. They would talk perhaps about the flowers that were displayed in the alcove that you see there with the scroll hanging in it. So the tokonoma, that's called. And so samurai warriors, they were Zen Buddhists quite frequently, and they were also trained tea masters. They trained in ikebana or flower arranging. So they were people with a very heightened aesthetic awareness. And one of the things that they valued in beauty was a certain rusticity. So what they called, and what we now have become quite fond of saying, wabi-sabi. So something that's a little bit off, not perfect, worn through constant use, not necessarily regular, something that's developed a beautiful sheen over time, something that's been repaired, for example. There's a real interest now in the Japanese tradition of repairing broken ceramics, the art of kintsugi, for example. This wabi-sabi was something that the people designing these Zen rock gardens understood. So part of the beauty of a garden like Ryoanji, probably the most famous Zen garden in the world, is also that kind of rustic shape of the rocks. Now, the rocks are highly symbolic. Some people say that this garden is like a painting on a scroll of a tiger with her cubs struggling to get across a roiling sea, and you would see the gravel as the waves of that sea and the rocks as the tiger and her cubs. Others say that the rocks have been arranged very carefully so that you can only ever see 14 rocks at one time. And if you can see and count 15 rocks, it means that you've reached enlightenment. So there's something to try to do should you end up in Kyoto. Try and count 15 rocks here. But you can see it's a very, very simple garden. It really does satisfy some of those conditions that are prized by the Zen Buddhists. It's simple, it's quite rustic, there's a hardness to it as well. Some of us probably would have difficulty even referring to this as a garden because there's no real organic component in terms of plants in this garden at all. But you can see that in fact it's very carefully designed. Now, it's designed to be seen from a seated position on a veranda outside the abbot's headquarters. So it's designed for meditation, and that links into Zen Buddhism and the way in which it really privileges meditation. So you sit, you look, you contemplate, you try to see 15 rocks and realize that you haven't reached enlightenment yet. You keep meditating. Now you've got the extraordinary texture of the rocks. Remember, you've got a symbolism or an apparent symbolism in their grouping. You've got a very strong patina of age in that clay wall that encloses this garden. And that clay wall there, the boundary that you see around this garden, well, it had oil mixed in with the clay, and the oil has seeped out over time, and that's what gives that darker shade to parts of this wall, and that's very wabi-sabi. There's a rusticity in that. It's certainly not perfect. You've got quite a redundant little roof on that fence. The average fence doesn't need to be protected from the rain. And so in fact, what that roof is doing is not protecting the clay wall below. It funnels your eyes back down into the garden. So it's an angle that comes down towards the gravel, towards the boulders. And so should your eye, this is very closely related, I think, to the process of meditation. Should your eye wander, you have the wall to bring you back down into the space in front of you. That's what you should be meditating on. And should your mind or eye wander, should you want to look at that beautiful cherry tree, for example, the angle of that fence and it's the angle of the roof on the fence funnels your eyes back into that space, keeps you meditating on the garden in front of you. But the garden beyond introduces a real sense of tension, what we might call in a spiritual sense, temptation. You can see that those bright green leaves, well, those are Japanese maples. So you can imagine what this garden looks like in autumn. In spring, you've got, as you can see here, cherry blossom. You've got more vibrant greens in the maples in summer. So there's always something out there in the garden beyond to distract you, but the meditation garden, the dry rock garden, wants to keep you thinking and keep you contemplating. So there's a lot of tension built into this garden. The more you look for it, the more you will see how this garden is controlling how you look at it. And I don't think we should lose sight of the way in which it's designed to work with the rooms behind it. So here you're looking at an image of the abbot's headquarters behind the garden. So the veranda that you sit on, in fact, to look out at the garden is over here on your right. And you can see the sliding doors inside this abbot's headquarters really speak to the garden outside. First of all, you've got inkwash paintings showing stylized Chinese landscapes with very similar boulders to those groupings that are in miniature form outside in the garden. But also because of the inkwash, it's actually quite hard to work out what you're looking at here, to make out exactly what you're seeing, especially when you look at some of the more abstract scenes in the distance. And this is another concept that Zen spoke about. That was the idea of yugen, which is that reality, the real nature of things is quite hard to perceive with our human eye. We have to go within and use meditation in order to understand the true nature of the world around us. So you can see how the garden and the space, the built space, are working together quite carefully. And that happens in modern Zen gardens as well. So this is a very beautiful Zen water garden that is attached to the museum commemorating D.T. Suzuki, who was the Zen master who really introduced Zen Buddhism to the West in the 20th century. And he was from Kanazawa, where the very famous garden of Kenrokuen is. And so in his museum today, you have a very shallow water garden. Its surface is only rarely broken by a bubbling of water that does not break the surface. It just bubbles up to the surface in a round shape. The circle is very important symbolically in Zen Buddhism. And then that planar surface is really strongly concentrated with that cube of the meditation hall there, where you sit in the meditation hall and simply look out to the surface of the water around you. So very similar, in fact, to the Zen rock garden at Ryoanji, but here made out of the elements of water and very, very contemporary architectural design. Notice that we're back to a contrast between a planar surface or line and mass or volume in that meditation hall. And we're also here dealing with a meditation concept as well, which is the idea of thing and no thing. So when you meditate on things that really are, but you also are meditating on the idea of no thing or the absence of things, a concept that's very hard to grasp. And again, you have that tension here, the thingness of the meditation hall and the no thingness of the surface of the body of water. So a really sensitive contemporary design here that's drawing on that tradition of Zen Buddhism. The other thing that's really key in the Zen garden is the absence of colour, and I think perhaps this is why it's troubling for some of us to call these gardens gardens. There's no plants, no colour brought by plants, or very little colour brought by plants. But this is in fact celebrating something that, again, Zen has a phrase for, and that is yohaku no bi, which is the beauty of extra white. So we're back to the idea of purity and cleanliness again. Think about a Zen garden. What throws those rocks and boulders into such sharp relief is the fact that they are surrounded by such pure white gravel. Similarly, looking at the dragon inside Ryoanji Temple and its sliding doors in the abbot's headquarters, you can see that the dragon here, the what gives the dragon its shape is actually what hasn't been drawn in. So you've got ink that's been blown in a kind of a wash to give a sense of the blackness of the space around the dragon, but the dragon's own body is simply the white of the screen door itself. So he has been created almost like the negative, a photographic negative. He is created by what isn't painted on rather than what is painted on, if that makes sense. And it's a similar idea with the gravel. So that white gravel throws what's around it into greater relief. You see the beauty of extra white in another very famous Zen garden, also in Kyoto. This is the garden at Daisen Inn Sub-Temple, and it's very small. It's only 3 meters deep, and it surrounds 3 sides of the abbot's headquarters. So whereas Ryoanji is a fixed point garden, you sit in one place on the veranda and meditate, you don't move. At this Zen garden, in fact, which side of the abbot's headquarters you stand on will vary what element of the garden you're looking at. And they're very symbolic elements. It represents the journey of our life, the river of life, starting again at the mountain at the center of the universe, which I've spoken about already in the Buddhist tradition. So starting here, you can see the gravel, which represents the river of life in this instance, is emanating from that mountain, coming out and flowing in quite an agitated way by lots of rocky boulders. So we start off with kind of a bit of a rocky start, but then you can see emerging on the other side, so that this section here through this window is what you're looking at on the right. But as the gravel river emerges on the other side, you can see we get a little bit of control and we get a handle on what's going on around us. This is a boat. You can see that beautiful boulder shaped like a boat here that will carry us safely down life's river. You can see the waves have become less turbulent. There are no boulders, no big boulders here disturbing the river of life. And hopefully this means that by the end of your life, you might reach the peace of enlightenment. So this is the final part of that garden. Very, very big expanse of pure white gravel, only 2 conical mounds to disturb the surface, kind of the punctuation of the void with volume. So thing and no thing is here as well. And you can see a very, very calm raking of the gravel here. The maintenance of the gravel is, of course, extraordinary. Some of these Zen gardens, the gravel has to be raked in the designs, very wide rakes. It's raked every single morning in order to keep the design. And frequently, once a design was established, we know from visual evidence like scrolls, for example, that the design has been maintained. So generations of monks have been raking the gravel in the same way to keep those designs ever present in those gardens. So real respect of the tradition from which they emerged. The last type of garden I'd like to talk to you about is the stroll garden, and this emerges out of a period that we refer to as the Edo period. They date more or less to the same time as that Sakoku period that I started with. So remember, in the 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate has managed to take control of all of Japanese territory. It closes off to the outside world, but it also does some other things. It establishes a new capital, more or less in the middle of all of its territory, and that's Edo, a city that today we call Tokyo, on Tokyo Bay or Edo Bay. Tokyo simply means eastern capital. Kyoto means capital city. So the capital of Japan is moved from Kyoto, the traditional imperial capital of Japan, to this new capital, Edo, which will be known eventually as Tokyo, or the eastern capital. And the shogun is very clever. He legislates that those people who have helped him win political rule, they must alternately live near him in the city, in Edo, and back on their original ancestral lands, and that they must rotate. So only 50% of the nobles are ever in Edo at one time, while the other 50% are back at their traditional homelands. And the women and children stay in the capital. They stay in Edo. So the men and their retainers, the samurai, they move back and forth. They cycle with the other lords on this kind of rotation system, whereas the women remain in Edo, where the shogun can keep an eye on them and use them as political hostages if his lords, who have helped him win power, if they get a little bit restless. He's worked out this alternate residence system in order to minimize their power. When they're in Edo, they are required, but they also want to live in very luxurious residences to demonstrate their power. And similarly, when they're back in their ancestral territory, they also want to establish themselves in luxurious residences or castles in those towns in order to show their power, their might, and also their sophistication. And so alongside those town palaces and country castles, we have the development of huge gardens, which are known as stroll gardens, because you don't appreciate these gardens from a boat like you did the Heian-era pond touring gardens. Rather, you walk through these. They are extensive, so that when you have visitors, you've created what we might call a series of garden rooms. An unfolding scroll might be an easier way to think about it in the Japanese tradition, of all of these varied experiences that will change throughout the seasons. So the garden will be different in winter to the garden in summer, but it will be just as beautiful. And what you are looking for is an experience that wows your visitors, that takes their breath away. And one of the most famous Edo period stroll gardens that we have is this extraordinary garden in Kanazawa, Kenrokuen, which we'll return to shortly. Now, these gardens are designed to impress, and they're also designed to be quite playful and quite light. So you don't need to sit and meditate as you do in a Zen garden and meditate on the impermanence of life's beauty and the difficulty of reaching enlightenment. No, the idea is that here you will enjoy yourself, you will be surprised, you will be overcome by the amazing experience that you're being conducted through. And so we have jokes in these Edo period stroll gardens. Some of the jokes can be a little bit difficult for us to get now, either linguistically or historically. So for example, this is known as a full moon bridge, and this was quite a common joke in these Edo period gardens, and you might have seen them in Japanese gardens constructed overseas as well. So note that here in Tokyo, in a wonderful Edo period garden that's still quite easy to visit, Koishikawa Karakuen, this full moon bridge, well, it only becomes a full moon when you stand in a certain position and see a reflection of the other half of the bridge in the water. So obviously when I look at the arch of this bridge, I only see a half moon, but if I stand in the right place, I see its reflection in the water, and that makes it a full moon bridge. So it's a little bit of a linguistic joke that you only get if you stand in the right place. Something else that the Edo period gardens incorporate is this idea of magnificence, of encompassing an extraordinary amount of space. So this is about asserting power and rule, obviously. So you want your garden to look huge, even if maybe it isn't as big as it seems. And this is something that we call borrowed scenery. The idea here is that you design your garden very carefully to incorporate some pre-existing element that extends the garden and makes it seem bigger than it is. So this is a wonderful example of borrowed scenery at the Adachi Art Museum in Yasugi, for example. Those mountains, which are heavily wooded, they do not form part of this garden at all, but they are an absolute backdrop for the garden and make it seem as if the garden stretches on forever. In actual fact, the garden ends about here. So in the midground, so you can see what they've done is they've incorporated the mountains in the distance as the foreground or the background of this garden. They've looked carefully at the type of trees that are growing here at the extreme reaches of the garden, growing wild in nature, and they have implemented a use of similar conifers throughout the garden itself in the foreground. So this is actually a very narrow garden. It only goes as far back as that clipped lawn there, but it looks much more extensive as it is. And notice that careful pruning has kept the trees very, very low, has given these extraordinary button shapes to the azalea. You can imagine what they will look like when they're in bloom. But this is all being kept very, very low so that your eye reaches towards the horizon. You move very clearly in this garden from a foreground to a midground to a background. And that has been achieved by borrowing those mountains in the distance in order to give the garden a frame within which it sits. Now, sometimes in the case of these 17th century stroll gardens that survive in cities that have changed, like Tokyo or Edo, for example, we have unintentional borrowed scenery. So if you did make your way to the wonderful Koishikawa Korakuen in Tokyo, you'll see unintended borrowed scenery, where the beautiful long plain of the pond here and then of those carefully managed trees in the midground are given a very definite background, in this case by the Tokyo Dome, obviously not part of the original design of this garden, but still a type of borrowed scenery, if unintentionally. But as I said, some of the playfulness in these stroll gardens is very difficult for us to see now. For example, this mound of grass in, again, Koishikawa Korakuen in Tokyo, it seems reasonably unimpressive. Well, it's actually a form of miniature bamboo. It's no bigger than blades of grass, but it is bamboo. And it has been planted all over this man-made set of hills in order to recreate real scenery. And this was a Chinese mountain called Mount Lu, which was known in Japan through scrolls, through paintings, as you can see on the right there. It was considered a model of scenic beauty. And so in this garden in Tokyo, it has been recreated in miniature, a bit like miniature golf, but using this miniature bamboo rather than full-sized bamboo as in the actual mountain. So a playful recreation of the scenery that you, an educated aristocratic visitor to this 17th century garden, would have been able to recognise, but which today is a little bit arcane. I don't think the average visitor is struck by it. So to conclude, I want to come to that magnificent example of an Edo period stroll garden, which I've spoken about a number of times. That's Kenrokuen in Kanazawa. And this is ranked, and the Japanese love ranking, it's ranked as one of the best gardens in all of Japan. It's in the top 5. I think it's number 1, if not number 2. And that's because it's known historically as the Garden of the 6 Attributes. So borrowing from Chinese garden design theory, Japanese gardeners, particularly of the Edo period or these stroll gardens, that the period in which they're being created, the garden designers held quite strongly that by holding in balance 6 seemingly contradictory characteristics, and notice how many times I've returned to that idea of balance, so the tension that has to be held so carefully in balance in a Japanese garden. If they were able to hold those 6 characteristics in this careful, tense balance, they would achieve the most beautiful type of garden possible. But it was considered an almost impossible ask. And this garden is known, in fact, as the Garden of the 6 Characteristics in Kanazawa because it's thought to be a successful example of a garden planned in the 17th century to balance all of these characteristics. So they are artifice and antiquity, watercourses and panorama, spaciousness and seclusion. Now, this is an extraordinarily large garden, and I can't take you all around it, obviously, but just in this one image, you can see how some of those 6 characteristics are being held in a careful balance. Well, artifice, something new, something innovative. Here we have the innovation of those wonderful rice straw ropes that are strung up in the colder seasons as canopies over these very carefully pruned and eminent trees that have been trained and pruned to stretch out across the surface of the water and really highlight the horizontality of this scene. And what they do is when there's a heavy snowfall, they break the weight of the snowfall and stop it from resting on the branches of these trees, which might lead those branches to break off, ruining all of that careful work of training and pruning. So these extraordinary canopies, you see them all throughout Japan. And here they're the element of the new. So they have to be remade every season because, again, they're made out of these seemingly fragile materials. And they are what bring the element of artifice here. Whereas antiquity is provided by this very celebrated old stone lantern, which is the emblem, in fact, of this entire garden. So it's a very well-known symbol of this garden in Japan. That's our antiquity. Watercourses, well, that's self-explanatory. What you can't see is that off to the left is a very expansive view over a plateau. This garden's on a plateau, and you get a long view from the plateau over to the mountains in the distance. So from water, we move to panorama. So both water and land are both covered, but we've also got spaciousness and seclusion, because as you can see from the size of this one pond in the garden, it's an extraordinarily large garden, and yet you can see in the distance from those careful plantings of trees that you move from space to space through this garden. So it feels very intimate at the same time as you have these wow moments when you come across a pond like this one and realize just how big the garden is. Now, something that I haven't really brought out, but which I'll end with, is the way in which the seasons work through these gardens. The idea is in the stroll garden, but really throughout all of Japanese garden history, with that really strong appreciation for nature, the idea is that the garden has to be beautiful regardless of the season. You don't just have a spring garden, you have a garden that looks wonderful all year round. And this is where we get colour and traditional plantings. So from the cherry blossoms of spring here, again in Kenroku-en Garden, again carefully trained and supported to stretch out across the surface of the water. From there, we move to a kind of allegorical water garden in the Imperial Shrine in Tokyo, the Meiji Shrine. This is a river of irises. It's not really a river. The colour of the water is provided only when the irises are in bloom. And there's a range of purple and mauve, blue and white irises here that are graded, really. The tone of them is graded to give a sense of water running just in the summer months. So you might go to this wonderful garden in winter, but it won't give you that same effect of the cooling river that you get from the irises in summer. I think none of us needs encouragement to think of the beauty of Japanese gardens in autumn, the range of russets, yellows, golds and green that can be carefully managed from a mass planting of maples, as you see here at the Silver Pavilion Temple in Kyoto, through to a careful scattering of maples to bring a wave of colour through the garden in autumn, just as privileged as the gardens are in winter. And in fact, I will return to this scene on the pond to show you how important winter is to the garden as well. So you can see snow in the background here that has fallen on some of the heavily clipped azaleas. You can imagine it would make them white buttons low to the ground. And then when we have a heavy snowfall, you'll have the beauty of the snow built up on these ropes, stopping it from snapping the branches below. So a respect of tradition, a respect of the maintenance that goes into the garden, but above all, a really extraordinary history of garden design, which has come to inform the beautiful surviving gardens that we see in Japan. So it's been a real pleasure to address you today about the history of the Japanese garden and the way in which Japan's unique natural, political and artistic contexts have really brought to bear on the development of that tradition. Thank you very much.